For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Tabi Madiba, lecturer in the Department of Political and International Studies at Rhodes University. Bongani Nyoka joins me to discuss his book titled The Social and Political Thought of Archie Mafeje. Briefly give us some insight into his early life and what role he played in politics.
Archie Mafeje was born Archibald Monwabisi Mafeje in Engobo, here in the Eastern Cape, on the 30th of March in 1936. He went to one of the prestigious schools for blacks at the time, which was Hilltown Institute or Hilltown College, where he met one of the prominent leaders of a political movement called the Non-European Unity Movement. This mentor of his was Livingston Coates. This is a man who introduced him to Marxism and a thoroughgoing understanding of political developments in South Africa during apartheid. And so that's when he began to be politically active. But from there, he went to study at the University of Fort Hare in the late 1950s. But for some reason, he couldn't finish his studies at Fort Hare. So there was a strike, I think it was around either 1955 or 1956, of the students there, and he had to suspend his studies. And he returned the following year, but still he did not complete. And he ended up going to UCT, the University of Cape Town, I think it was 1957. There he met other leaders of the Unity Movement in Cape Town intellectual circles. And that's where he really began to do political work, political activism. And he combined this with his studies of the social sciences at UCT, where he studied under Monica Wilson and Jack Simons, amongst other people. And some of his peers there were people like Neville Alexander, Fikile Palm. And he, at some point, I think it was 1962 or 1963, he had gone to the Eastern Cape to conduct field work for his master's thesis. And during that period, he was caught doing political work, trying to conscientize people in Flagstaff in the Eastern Cape. And he was charged for that, but he was later released, and he completed his master's, and he left South Africa for the United Kingdom, where he pursued his PhD at the University of Cambridge. He completed his PhD in 1968. And in the same year, he applied for a teaching post at UCT, senior lecturer in social anthropology. He got the job on merit, but the apartheid government, the Minister of Education at the time, Senator de Klerk, put pressure on UCT to rescind Mafeje's appointment, saying that, look, a black man cannot be employed in a so-called white university. And so Mafeje never returned to South Africa. He remained in exile. He married an Egyptian feminist scholar, Shahid Al-Baz, and he lived in Cairo for most of his life. He returned to South Africa in 2002, and he worked at UNISA for a few years, I think maybe 2 or 3 years, and he retired. Mm-hmm. And he died in 2007. Before he went to Hilltown, he studied at Ngabaga Secondary School, in the Transkei. There he met one of the leaders. I think this is the man who actually introduced him to political work. Nathaniel Onono. He was a school principal there. And so he tasked Mafeje and some of his peers to distribute literature, magazines, and newsletters of the Unity Movement. So that's where he really began. That was now in the early 50s.
And why, according to Mafeje, has decolonization gained more traction than any of the ideas such as reform, transformation, and Africanization?
Well, I mean, that's something I say in the introduction to the book. I think that, I mean, if you look at these things, these concepts, they happen in succession in the sense that one is typically replaced by the other because the other is viewed as not effective enough. I think that part of what has made the discourse around decolonization gain more traction than the other concepts, particularly in the second decade of the 21st century. I would personally, I mean, I don't know about other people, but I would attribute this to the advent of the Rhodes Must Fall and the Fees Must Fall uh, student movements in South African universities. Because what I've seen is that although these ideas were put forward before the movement, they seem to, I don't know, to gain more prominence precisely because this is what the students were saying, but also amplifying what their lecturers and professors were saying before them. And so you would find that in South African universities, these were isolated individuals who were making this kind of cause for decolonization. But when the movement came along in 2015, suddenly these ideas, which were pushed to the corners of South African universities, were relatively obscure, suddenly gained prominence because the movement itself was prominent not only in the universities but in South African political and social life more broadly. So I would certainly attribute this and I mean, even black academics now in South African universities have become emboldened. You know what I'm saying? They are bold now and they can make claims which initially they couldn't make, or if they could make, but they were not listened to. You know?
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, I mean, at the same time, I mean, I do say in the book that these ideas are not new. They've been there for quite some time. But what's interesting is the moment now in which they've become prominent, not only in the universities, but also outside of the universities. And I'd certainly make the strong claim that this is attributable to the Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall movements.
Mm-hmm. And briefly talk to us about Mafeje's ideology of tribalism and why did he reject the entity of tribe?
Well, at the time that Mafeje wrote, particularly when he began to pursue his academic work in the 1960s and in the 1970s, Africa and other parts of the global south at the time were decolonizing at a political level. And people like Mafeje and his radical peers, such as Bernard Makubane, Samir Amin, and several others, were trying to decolonize knowledge because they saw that the idea of decolonizing only politically is not enough because knowledge, particularly the social sciences, were themselves part of the colonial project. And so the concept of tribe, which was used, and the idea of tribalism, was used by anthropologists and other social scientists to explain political conflicts on the African continent, particularly amongst Africans or Black people. And so Mafeje does not necessarily reject the entity of tribe as being non-existent, but he says it's outdated. It's because anthropologists described or defined the concept of a tribe as a political and economically self-sufficient and bounded communities or societies. And Mafeje was saying, look, During the advent of colonialism, this idea that they were pure entities which were called tribe was no longer the case. And therefore, the idea of tribalism, which is one ethnic group fighting over the other, was not sufficient as an explanation for political conflicts on the African continent. Yeah, so it does not necessarily reject the entity of tribe. It simply says that this is an outdated concept in explaining African societies because there have been intermingling and migration across borders on the African continent for quite some time.
And he said that ethnicity may lead to disaster. Why do African elites continue with what would suggest a level of irrationality in the elite mobilization of ethnic Jongaism?
Well, part of his explanation is that the idea of tribalism or ethnicity wasn't just used by European colonialists or European social scientists, but was also used by African leaders for their own political ends. And therefore, you would find that in some African countries, particularly in places like Kenya, before the election, you will always find that there will be some conflict over this or the other issue. But you would find that the most salient issue would be around ethnicity and tribes. And this is fueled by politicians themselves or African leaders.
Can you explain to us why Mafeje rejected the dominant view that agrarian transformation in Africa was constrained by alleged deficiencies in African land tenure systems?
The most popular explanation amongst, I'd say, liberal and also radical scholars is that African land tenure systems are communal. That is to say, land on the African continent is owned by communities. And Mafeje is saying, but that is not the case because African land tenure systems are based on lineage. That is to say, I inherit land from my father who inherited land from his father and so on and so on. And therefore the idea, so land is owned by individual families rather than communities, particularly arable land, land that we use for subsistence and for living. It is only grazing fields that are communally shared, where we sell our livestock, cattle and goats or sheep. This is the land that is owned communally. And therefore, the explanation amongst some social scientists has been that, look, the reason why we cannot have land reform on the African continent is precisely because this land is owned by communities. And therefore, it's a free-for-all, and it is difficult for governments to come up with reform strategies that would suit all communities. And Mafeje says, but that is not true at all, particularly here in South Africa, where there was a quit rent system, a Quit Rent Act of 1927, which made Black people or Africans in South Africa tenants of the state. So you would pay rent for your own land to the state. And it says on those bases, individual families were tenants of the state rather than owning land as a community. So the idea that you cannot have land reform because of a communal land tenure system is completely false.
And why do you say the demarcation between Mafeje's earlier and later contributions to revolutionary theories and politics may give a false impression that there is no connection between the two?
Well, it was a caution on my part because, sometimes in social scientific work, when you talk about a scholar's early work and later work, people seem to think that this person has rejected his earlier ideas or he has shifted from what he used to say and now is advocating something else. I was merely making that caution that, look, what Mafeje did, particularly in his work on revolutionary theory, in the 1970s, except for one article which he wrote on Soweto and the uprisings of 1978. But generally, his work during that period in the early 80s wasn't purely limited to South Africa. He was writing about Africa in general and other parts of the global South or the third world. So it is only in the mid to the 1990s that he began to write about South Africa specifically and Southern Africa generally. So that's why I make that demarcation. And I'm saying people shouldn't think that there was a shift in terms of his thinking or in terms of his revolutionary theory. The only shift was what he focused on. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So his earlier work, he was focusing on Africa and the global South generally. And then in his later revolutionary theory, he focused on South Africa and the surrounding African, Southern African countries, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and so on.
Mm-hmm. And he said that the national question entailed asserting the humanity of African people, attaining independence, and maintaining the unity of the new state. So why does he say it is difficult to settle the national question in South Africa?
In other African countries, what happened during the liberation period, say from the late 50s to the 1960s and the 70s, the colonialists were pushed out. But in South Africa, this did not happen. Hence, some South African theorists talk about colonialism of a special type, because in South Africa, we have a settler white society or community that is physically present with us at this moment. And therefore, you say, so long as whites, particularly at the time that he was writing, were claiming that they are South African, and so long as black people themselves are said that they are South African in a land that they do not own, the national question in South Africa will remain unresolved until such time as we resolve the land question. So he links the national question to the land question.
Mm-hmm. And lastly, talk to us about the inspiration behind this book and what you hope people to take away after reading your book.
The inspiration behind the book, I mean, the book is, I've been collecting Mafeje's work for, I think, since 2006. Since I first heard his name, I was still an undergraduate at the time. And I've been collecting his work since then. I then used it for my master's thesis for the so-called theoretical framework. After that, I decided to focus specifically on his work when I was doing my PhD thesis. And basically the book derives from not only my PhD thesis, but also from the work that I've been doing and collecting on Mafeje for years, since 2006. So it might sound like something of a cliche to say this, but Mafeje was, as a matter of fact, ahead of his time in the sense that some of the issues that are popular now, whether you're talking about land or whether you're talking about decolonizing the social sciences, and also on revolutionary theory, these are issues that Mafeje wrote about like since the 1960s. And my hope is that people, because here in South Africa, we are typically interested in newness. You know, we always think something is new, someone has said something, whereas some of the things that we debate and discuss today have been said by people like Mafeje, like N.H. Beers a long time ago. So I'm hoping that people would, in trying to understand theoretically some of the issues that we are debating today, that they could tap into the works of people like Archie Mafeje and some of his radical peers, because they gave us the blueprint in a way, on how to address some of the issues that we are currently discussing.
That was Bongani Nyoka speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about the social and political thought of Archie Mafeje.